Hello, folks. Thank you for joining us today. We will get started even as a few others are joining us. My name is Molly Levy. I work in the Alumni Relations Office at Hamline, and I'm so pleased to have David Schultz with us again today to talk about understanding the 2022 elections. And David, I think it was early this summer when we picked this date and this topic, and it was the right thing to do. And thank you for your time. I'm going to just set us up, do a few housekeeping things, introduce David properly, and then we'll be off to the races. So again, my name is Molly Levy. I work in the Alumni Relations Office here at Hamline. And today's Leo lecture, as you know, I'm sure by now, you will be muted and your camera will be off for today's presentation. Now, this second bullet point is a little bit wrong. David and I actually would prefer questions that you have throughout his talk. Go ahead and put them in the chat. He is going to be focused on watching that chat as he goes. And if you've been to one of David's talks before, you know questions are a big part of what we'll do over the next hour. So Randy, I see you've got a question in the Q&A. That is just fine. Thank you for that. And folks, just go ahead and put your questions in as David is talking, and he will pull them out as he's going along. A little hint, if it's helpful for you, go ahead and click on speaker view to see the speaker in the frame, if that's your preference. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce David Schultz so I can hand it over to him entirely. David Schultz is Distinguished University Professor of Political Science and Legal Studies. He has a BA and MA in Political Science and Philosophy, a JD and LLM in law, and a PhD in political science, and a master's degree in astronomy, a 3-time Fulbright scholar who has taught extensively in Europe and Asia, and the winner of the Leslie A. Whittington National Award for Excellence in Public Affairs Teaching. David is the author of more than 35 books and 200 articles on various aspects of American politics, election law, and the media and the politics. He is regularly interviewed and quoted in local, national, and international media on these subjects, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Economist, and NPR. His most recent books, Caveat, you should have seen in the chat, he's got reference to a book that just came out this week. I'm sure he'll mention that. Other recent books are Encyclopedia of Money in American Politics and Presidential Swing States. Prior to teaching, Professor Schultz also served as a city director of code enforcement, zoning, and planning in Binghamton, New York, and worked as a housing and economic planner in New York as well. And here we go, understanding the 22 elections, who won, who lost, and who cares. David, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for coming today. And I do encourage questions. There's this old story that says that journalists write the first draft of history. And the reason why I mention this is that today, by the time I'm getting to the Leo lecture, this is already my 4th talk I've given since Election Day, trying to make sense out of what happened. And obviously we're evolving, we're getting more information, I'm getting more opportunity to sort of think through what's going on today. So what I want to do today is, of course, sort of talk about what actually happened in the elections. And some of what you're going to hear about today too is some works in progress or ideas in progress as I'm trying to interpret a variety of things that are going on, given the fact that we don't have all the data in front of us, we don't have all the voting, we're still operating a little bit in waiting for the elections to finish, I guess, because we know we're going to have some runoff still in terms of what's happening. So today you're going to sort of get to hear me sort of like think out loud on some issues, and I think it'll be kind of fun. Now, one of the things that I tell my students all the time at Hamline is that political science on one level is easy. It comes down to 3 words. It's about what? It's about describe, explain, predict. And what I say to my students, the first task of political scientists is just simply to describe what happened. And I'm going to try to do that today. I'm going to try to describe what happened in terms of our the 2022 election cycle. But then the second step is going to explain. And I'm going to try to explain why the election turned out the way at least many of the pundits didn't think it was going to turn out. And then a little bit of prediction in terms of where does this all take us? What does it all mean? And I will at some point, since I did post in here, I will post and talk a little bit about the book that just came out the other day. And again, And so if I forget to do this before the end, make sure Molly or Phil or somebody, people remind me in terms of talking about this, the book. All right. So what I want to do also in terms of my talk today is first, I want to set the context for the 2022 elections. That's going to be the part of what I do in the beginning here. Then I'm going to talk about the pattern and typical pattern of midterm election cycles. And so I'm going to take us back in time a little bit, about 6 months. Then we're going to talk about how the 2022 election cycle unfolded. Then a little bit about winners and losers. And then with that, the what next in terms of national politics, state politics, and so forth like that, and try to think about it in both levels. It's just funny, I should mention to you also, as some of you are probably thinking about this, after my talk today, Jeff Wagner, who's at WCCO television, contacted me for the Good Question today. If some of you have seen Good Question on WCCO, know what I'm referring to. And the Good Question today he wanted to ask me is, when does the 2024 presidential election start? And my answer will be to him, probably it already started at this point, and we'll think about that somewhere along the line. And I say that also for those of you like me who are kind of like, 2022 is over, I'm exhausted. Well, we're already 2024. All right, so let's first think about context. And if I'm thinking about context, there are 4 words that I want us to think about in terms of understanding the 2022 election cycle. Let me mention those 4 words first, and then I will come back and explain each one of them. The first word for understanding context is about polarization. The second word will be Donald Trump. That's 2 words, of course. The third word will be stolen elections. And the fourth word will be democracy. So I want us to think about these. And the way I want to start is, let's think about the political world that we live in today. Now, I generally don't teach with PowerPoints. I generally don't do presentations with PowerPoints. My joke is I can probably bore people with just words without PowerPoints. But if I actually had a PowerPoint, or if I had a chalkboard or a whiteboard behind me, what I would start off by telling you right now is that we live in a bimodal world. And what I mean by that, and I would draw a bimodal world, kind of goes up on one side, comes down, goes up on the other. I would say that the state of American politics today is bimodal. And this is important for a contrast. And I'm going to compare America today to America 50 years ago, but with the emphasis today. 50 years ago, if I were giving this lecture and I were talking to you and I were to say to you, let's look at public opinion polls, let's look at surveys of American public opinion, and we were to map American public opinion out on a graph with responses from the most liberal to the most conservative to most liberal, I don't care which way you do it, public opinion would form a bell curve. We would have found a half a century ago, even maybe 40 years ago, that the vast majority of American public opinion converged to the center. Yes, some very liberal, yes, some very conservative, but American politics headed towards the center with a broad political consensus on a variety of issues. We would know, if we were to draw this bell curve, draw an imaginary line down the center, we would call that the median voter. Half of voters were to the left, half to the right. But American politics was centrist. We would also know that the Republican and Democratic parties, the centers of those 2 parties, were very close to that median voter. We would also know, back 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that both the Democratic and Republican parties were ideologically diverse. You would find a Dave Durenberger liberal and a Barry Goldwater conservative in the Republican Party. You would find a Ted Kennedy liberal, a Jimmy Carter centrist, a George Wallace conservative within the Democratic Party. The parties were ideologically diverse. We would have also found 40 to 50 years ago that of the 435 US House seats, approximately 1/3 or 120 were swing districts. Yes, 2/3 were solidly Democrat or solidly Republican, but neither the Democrats or Republicans alone on a straight party line could do what they want. They had to rely upon these swing districts. And in these swing districts, they were swing because they were evenly balanced Democrat and Republican. A candidate elected in those districts, veering too far to the left, too far to the right, would be out of election next time. These swing districts were the drivers of political compromise. They made or broke, they were make or broke, I guess, if I can say it that way, on political compromise. And then back then, 10 to 15% of the voters were swing. That is, in one election, they might vote for a Democrat for president, Republican for governor, et cetera, or one election vote Democrat, one election vote Republican. We live in a bell curve world a half a century ago. The result, most legislation was bipartisan in Congress, and we passed a lot of bills. And by the way, I could say to you, the same was true in Minnesota politics a half a century ago. Again, fast forward us to the present. At the present now, we live in that bimodal curve where we have, it goes up, it goes down, it comes like this. Yes, we can still bisect that curve. We can still identify a median voter, but that median voter is meaningless. At the end of the day, once we actually look at how people identify politically, in reality, including those who say they're not affiliated politically, it's clear. We've got clear patterns for Republican, clear patterns for Democrat. We know that the centers of the Democratic and Republican parties have moved further and further apart over time. In a situation like this, it no longer makes sense for Republicans or Democrats to nominate centrist candidates because there's not a lot of centrist voters. Pick candidates at the center of your parties. And the parties are moving further and further apart. We also know the two political parties have ideologically sorted themselves out. It is incredibly rare now to find liberals in the Republican Party and conservatives in the Democratic Party. Or the way I like to describe this, think about Minnesota politics. In 1986, a pro-life Democrat, Rudy Perpich, became governor, losing 4 years later to a pro-choice Republican, Arnie Carlson. You would never see anything like that anymore. The parties are now ideologically purified. Additionally, those swing voters, we're down to between 0 and 5% of the voters who are swing. The best predictor now of whether people are going to vote, Democrat or Republican, the best predictor of how they're going to vote, Democratic, Republican. 90% plus Democrats vote Democrat, 90% plus Republicans vote Republican. There's only an incredibly small number of swing voters out there. Among those critical swing voters, excuse me, I'm sorry, the number one, most important one, college-educated suburban women. They rock. They are the ones who drive American politics. I'll come back to them in a second. A second critical swing voter, people under the age of 30. A third critical constituency for swing voter are people who are people of color. But what we've seen is that swing voters disappear. Very few people now fit into that category. Politics is now about swinging in to vote, to show up to vote, swinging out and deciding not to vote. And what those swing voters do, especially college-educated suburban women, determine everything. When they show up, they generally vote Democrat, and Democrats have good years, like in 2018, 2020, and I think 2022. When they don't show up, such as in 2010 or 2016, Republicans have a good year. It's important to think about it. And then think about the 120 swing seats that used to exist 50 years ago, we're down to 30. In this election, we were only thinking about maybe 30 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives that would decide the balance of power that were competitive. At the Minnesota legislative level, about 10 seats, 12 seats maybe were in play. At the Minnesota Senate, probably no more than about 6 or 7. American elections are polarized. We are evenly divided. The parties have ideologically sorted themselves out. We have very few swing voters. We know that politics is all about moving marginal numbers of votes and voters in suburban districts. We know also that the parties are divided in many ways, by race, by gender, by geography. The new big divide in American politics is college degrees. For those who have some college or graduated from college, increasingly Democratic, voting Democratic. Democratic Party, for those who are without a college degree or college attempt, increasingly more likely to be Republican. We live in our bubbles in our world. Just to reinforce the bubbles, to show you how it is at this point. We also know that Democrats and Republicans don't like to live in the same neighborhoods. They live in different neighborhoods. They shop in different stores. They watch different television shows. We all know about sort of the MSNBC Democrats and the Fox Republicans. It's even better. In the last 3 elections, the best predictor of how people are going to vote, how areas are going to vote, proximity to Whole Foods, Chick-fil-A, and Cracker Barrel restaurants. I know you're all now thinking, how close are those restaurants or those places to me, or so forth. What I'm trying to capture here, we can't even begin to start to think about American politics unless we think about the degree of polarization over absolutely everything. And that was going into the election, and I think, unfortunately, coming out after the election is true. Second, it's the Trump factor. Although Donald Trump was not on the ballot, Trump loomed large in this election. He endorsed 300 candidates nationwide. He was stumping for candidates. He was out there trying to make this an election about him and his party strength. What we're going to find that many of his candidates lost. Think about it in Minnesota. The 2 candidates that he endorsed, Kim Crockett and Dr. Scott Jensen, did the worst of all the Republicans at the statewide level. Trump was on the ballot. And I'm going to come back and mention this because I think individuals, pollsters who were trying to understand the election failed to appreciate that. Third issue to understand for context is the stolen elections and what I'm going to call it January 6th. Clearly coming out of 2020, there was the mantra for some that the elections were stolen, that there was widespread voter fraud. Despite the fact that over 60 court cases refuted that, that was sort of the picture that was there. There was this intensity, fear, I think for many, that this was an election that could be stolen again, or conversely, an election in which people would claim that it was stolen. And then finally, with that, I should say, before I move on to the democracy issue, there was for many people the concern about what happened on January 6th after the election. Finally, American democracy. For many people, this was an election about the future of the heart and soul of American democracy. The concern about, was it going to be stolen? What was going to happen? And I mention this because when the pollsters were polling people during this election cycle, and the responses came back that 70 or 80% of the American public was saying the country's going in the wrong direction. Most pollsters inferred that to mean about crime or the economy or inflation. I'm going to argue that the pollsters missed something critical, that for many people, they missed the Trump factor, they missed the stolen elections factor, they missed the democracy on trial factor. All right, that's context. Let's walk us back in time, 6 months ago. Let's take us back to somewhere around, let us say, April or so, approximately, of this year. If we look at classic political science research, we know that a president's party generally does bad in midterm elections. Over the last half a century, if not more, probably almost back to World War II, in a midterm election, the president's party generally loses 26 seats in the House of Representatives, 4 seats in the US Senate. Given the fact that the Senate was 50-50, given the fact that the Democrats had about a 5-seat majority in the House of Representatives, a statistical good bet would be to say they were not going to hold on to either the House or the Senate. Additionally, pretty good research tells us that voters oftentimes make up their minds politically in approximately the second quarter of an election year. Factors such as the president's approval rating, as well as the state of the economy, are huge factors. Take us back to April or so. Joe Biden had an approval rating of about 38%. about where Donald Trump was at that same point in 2018, and Americans were feeling the pinch of the economy. It was gas prices back then. It was the supply chain issues forcing prices up. It was for every one of us who went to the grocery store and saw chopped meat up another dime, or went to the gas tank and it's creeping closer to, if not exceeding $4 a gallon, depending on what kind of gas you're buying. And it's costing, for some people with SUVs, over $100 to fill their tank. The economy was an issue. Put these numbers together. Last April, the argument was the Democrats are in for a beating. It is going to be the red wave that is going to overwhelm the Democrats. And that would have been our story if I had talked to you back then. But then something significant happened. In end of June, the US Supreme Court decided the Dobbs case, overturning Roe versus Wade and saying that the Constitution no longer protects abortion rights. What the court said is that now the question of abortion rights, if in fact any are going to exist, is up to state legislatures across the country. This appeared to energize Democrats. It gave Democrats a boost to mobilize their voters, because generally Republican voters are more reliable and are more likely to show up at elections than are Democrats. Those swing voters, people under the age of 30, people of color, college-educated suburban women, are somewhat less reliable to show up. So many thought that abortion was going to be the issue. And up until about a month ago, the polls caught that and reflected it. And suddenly it looked like for a while that the Democrats were going to have a better than anticipated year in terms of how it was going to play out. That no one actually thought seriously that the Democrats were going to hold on to the US House of Representatives, but they thought maybe the Democrats could hold on to the US Senate. And even up to about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, maybe approximately, there were projections by looking at polls that suggested that the Democrats could pick up 2 or 3 Senate seats of those approximately 9 competitive seats in places like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, across the border in Wisconsin. In those critical seats, the Democrats seemed to be alive and winning. And for many Democrats, they were salivating. Control of the Senate meant they could what? Still get the Biden judicial nominees through. Get up to 53 or so seats. Maybe Joe Manchin, maybe Kirsten Sinema in Arizona wouldn't be quite as critical. And maybe the Democrats would have an opportunity to do more things. But then about 3 to 4 weeks ago, the polls seem to be suggesting that continuing concern about inflation, about the economy, about a potential looming recession, about crime, seemed to suggest that the momentum was shifting back to the Republicans. And what we saw starting to emerge at this point in polls in the last week to 10 days, for example, in those 9 critical US Senate races, as late as last Friday, a week ago today, in 6 of 9 of them, the Republicans were ahead. And if those 6 races fell to the Republicans, they would wind up with about 52 seats in the US Senate. So many pundits, many people who were analyzing the elections were saying it's looking more and more like we're reverting back to what we thought it was going to be several months ago. And suddenly all these people were arguing Republican red wave again. For those of you who follow Nate Silver in Politics 538, he's basically putting the numbers in favor of saying the Republicans are going to have a good year. So that's where we would have been. That's sort of the contour of the shift. All right. So now what actually did happen? It's a lot more mixed and a lot more nuanced, especially at the national level, than most analysts are saying. Many are saying the Democrats had a great year. Well, they had a great year in the sense of they didn't do as badly as they could have done. But still, let's put it into perspective what happened to the Democrats. At the end of the day, more people voted for the Republicans in the House of Representatives than voted for Democrats. Even though we don't have the election settled yet, it is more likely than not that Republicans are going to take the U.S. House of Representatives. We clearly won't have the U.S. Senate settled until December with the runoff in Georgia. It's possible entirely that the Republicans still take control of the U.S. Senate. But even if they don't, even if Democrats hold the Senate but lose the House, it's not an overwhelming victory. They did better than they should have. But also keep in mind that with that, and I'll talk more about this in a second here, even if the Democrats hold the Senate but lose the House, Joe Biden's legislative agenda is over. He's not going to be able to do much for the next 2 years. And he's going to have to resort to what? Executive orders, marginal shifts, et cetera, et cetera. So I put that in context, that the Democrats didn't have as bad a day as thought. They did pick up some chambers. They did do well in Minnesota, but it's a much more nuanced in terms of what happened. Okay. But in places like Minnesota, and I'll confess and say, I didn't completely see what was going to happen here. I thought the Republicans were going to have both houses, and Jensen had an outside chance of being able to win the governorship. The polls indicated that Jim Schultz, no relationship to me, was going to win Attorney General. And I now look back and I say, I missed something that was so obvious that I know about. And we'll talk about this in a second here. So anyhow, I will simply say that it's more nuanced. We know across the country, some people did well in terms of Democrats, some Republicans did well. We'll do winners and losers in a few minutes here also too. So what happened in this election? If I've gone from the description, if I can now start to go to the explanation. Well, this is interesting. And I've actually talked to now, I think, 2 or 3 reporters in the last 24 hours on this issue. And let me use Minnesota as an example. Minnesota's voter turnout this year was 61%. We led the nation, or probably had led the nation with 61% voter turnout. We generally lead the presidential turnout at 80%. At 60%, that's pretty good. We didn't see an unusual blip in terms of turnout. So you can't say it was, on the face of it, a rush of voter intensity and new voters that came out that flooded the system and people missed. However, what I think happened is that the content of the voters changed. And for years, I've talked about, and I got a book coming out next spring, all about generational politics and how across generations, people of different generations have different political attitudes. And one of the things that I've been talking about for a while is how we are in the middle of a potential tipping point, a generational shift in American politics. The silent generation born between 1925 and 1944, the baby boomers born between roughly 45 and 60 or 1964, have dominated politics, but especially the baby boomers. For the last 30 years, they have been the largest voting bloc in America. Starting in 2020, we're beginning the beginning of the end of the baby boomer era of American politics. As of 2020, the millennials and Gen Z now constitute 37% of the electorate. What we're seeing is a content replacement of the electorate, exiting a couple of generations who are more conservative, being replaced by more liberal voters. Moreover, these are individuals who are hard to poll. For any of you who have adolescents, you'll know what I'm going to say here. You know, most polling is done on telephone. Again, nobody picks up their telephone anymore. Nobody has a landline. But also think to yourself, when was the last time you called your teenager on the phone and he or she picked up the phone? Never happens. You've got to text them, and it's hard to even get them at that point. And if certainly somebody texts them from a number they don't know, almost none of us pick up the phone anymore. I don't know about you. If I see a call coming from a number I don't know who it's from, I immediately infer that it's somebody trying to sell me something about my car warranty that's expired or something like that. I'm not picking up the phone. But pollsters, when they have a difficulty in general reaching people by survey, think about the difficulty of reaching young people. Now, oftentimes pollsters, in trying to figure out who's a likely voter, will ask questions such as, have you voted in a previous election, and so forth. And guess what? If you're polling young people who have not voted before, and they say they've never voted before, you're going to dismiss them and say they're not voting. Additionally, I have a hypothesis, can't prove it, that especially at a time when we have early voting, which makes it even harder to do polling, I think once people have voted, they're now done with the election. I voted, I did my stuff. I'm not going to talk to a pollster. I think we missed the fact that the composition of the electorate is starting to change pretty significantly. I know 5 years ago, I used to say that the generational shift was going to start in about 5 to 7 years. I think we're in the middle of it. I think we're in the middle of a generational shift that feels differently about the legalization of recreational marijuana, about LGBTQ issues. And it is a generation of young people. And I saw this with my students last semester, who take it as expected that they have a right to control, especially my female voters, to control their reproductive future. Along with those college-educated suburban women that, yes, they're concerned about the economy. Yes, they're concerned about other issues, but also this is a big issue. And so what I'm painting here is a nuanced picture. Think about the elections being a scale, kind of weighing it here, if I can kind of like weigh it like this. We got the economy, we've got inflation, we've got crime, we've got abortion politics. Collectively, they weighed very differently. And more specifically, for young people, for people of color, for college-educated suburban women, those issues weighed out in a specific way. And polling data missed it. Polling data missed the fact that, guess what? Our political system is about moving a marginal number of voters in a marginal number of suburban districts across the country. That's the battleground. It's about marginality. Polling at that level of detail would be beyond expense. You couldn't even do it. It'd be so difficult to do. That's what was missed. That is what was missed in this equation here in terms of the subtlety of the shifts that were going on. All right. And I think that's going to be fascinating to think about going forward. And again, I've already talked to at least three reporters on this issue in terms of how to go forward and think about these questions. Now, let's think a little bit now about winners and losers also. Well, who would we put in terms of our winners and losers category at this point? Well, in terms of winners, I'm going to say American democracy. And I say that because after this election, we are not hearing much about voter fraud and stolen elections. I think in part we're not hearing about it is because Republicans are going to win the House. They might win the Senate. They did reasonably well. Rick DeSantis did well. It's not going to be easy to say, I won. Oh, and by the way, there's widespread voter fraud. This makes it very, very difficult to be able to do. Second, in terms of winners and losers, Joe Biden looks a lot better today to many people than he did on Monday. I know Michael Barone said, oh, Biden was one of the big losers. On Monday, people thought Biden was going to weigh down the Democratic Party. Today, he looks much more viable than he did before. Another winner, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, he looks like now he's a major force in the Republican Party, and it's going to be a squaring off of him versus Donald Trump. Also, look across the country. If I am correct, in every state where there was an initiative or referendum on abortion, efforts to restrict abortion lost all across the country. That's pretty significant. How about losers? Donald Trump. There's no question about it. Donald Trump is being seen as a major loser in the election. Many of his candidates failed, including the two in this state, Crockett and Jensen. And so he looks less viable, less as a force than before. And it sets up for a real serious battle between him and DeSantis and the Republican Party. And if Liz Cheney opts to run within the Republican Party for president, it's going to set up a really fascinating dynamic. But someone should ask me a question about Trump in third party at some point. We might want to think about this. Okay. Others where I would put in terms of the losing category, again, I'm going to say the polls, the analysts, and Nate Silver. Nate Silver's prediction machines are only as good as the polls that go in. And many of you might have seen a piece that I did in MinPost, was it yesterday, that talked about polling failure, I'm sorry, pardon me, and about what we may need to do to correct them in the future. But there's a lot of bad polls out there. We need to be sorting out good from bad polls in terms of doing it. Okay, a few other winners and losers. The Minnesota Republican Party needs to be thinking about its next step. It's now been since 2006 when it won a last statewide election, 1972, since it won the last time it won the presidency here. It needs to be thinking where it wants to go in the future. Nationally, after the Republicans lost in 2012, Romney lost to Obama, the Republican Party issued a white paper that said, we need to reach out to women and to people of color to remain viable in the future. Well, Trump's partial takeover or total takeover of the Republican Party forestalled that. But there's a demographic problem. The problem being is that his core base, white working class, are decreasing as a percentage of the population every year. We are going to become a majority non-white city in a matter of just a few years. Now, I don't believe demographics are destiny. You still need good candidates, good messages, good parties, good campaigns. But clearly what we are starting to see at this point is that the Republicans, Minnesota and nationwide, need to broaden out. Now, for Democrats who want to, at the state level and national level, crow and strut and say, we had a great year. Again, remember, more people voted Republican in the House for the House members than Democrat. Democrats might lose both chambers of Congress. That's still not a victory. Saying you didn't get beat quite as badly is still not a victory at the end of the day. At the state level, the Democrats did take control of the Senate by one vote, 34-33. At the House level, it's 70-64. This is a very narrow margin. Many of the seats came from swing districts. The Democrats don't necessarily have a broad mandate. Many of them, and I was at a talk on Thursday where somebody said we have a $10 billion surplus, go big and go home. Well, try to, at a time when we have maybe a recession coming and inflation going, first, that 10 billion surplus may disappear pretty rapidly. Someone said, the more money we have, the more problems there are. There's going to be a lot of groups fighting for money. Additionally, there's talk for the Democrats of codifying legislation for Roe versus Wade. That's going to be a divisive issue in terms of winning over people. My point being is that it is not a slam dunk in terms of a win for the Democrats. Also, and I hope I'm not insulting anybody when I say this, the Democrats beat, at the state level especially, some pretty weak candidates. At the end of the day, Scott Jensen and Kim Crockett were not the strongest candidates in the world. Jim Schultz, who ran for Attorney General, was a hedge fund manager, no prosecutorial experience, in many ways didn't understand the job. The person who ran for auditor also had no background in this area. The Democrats beat if I can put it in sports analogy here, the Democrats beat a junior varsity team running. Had the Republicans mounted a better set of candidates, had Trump not been a factor in this election, Democrats could very well have taken a major hit. So that should be important to be thinking about here going forward. Thinking going forward here, there's going to be a tendency at the state level for the Democrats, as it's true for any side, to overreach. Look to see what might happen in terms of, will they try to overreach? Will they try to go big and go home? What might happen, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let me sort of wrap up with a couple of other things here, and it'll leave us with about, I guess, about 10 to 15 minutes for conversation in terms of it. So let me first approach the questions here. Will the grassroots legal cannabis party lose its major party status in Minnesota since it did not receive at least 5% of the vote in the last 2 statewide elections? The answer is probably yes. This also becomes a vindication for Ryan Winkler. He was a Democrat. He was the majority leader in the House who kept saying the Democrats need to embrace the legalization of marijuana so that people don't drift over to the 2 cannabis parties, marijuana parties. He might have been correct on this issue. Additionally, I'm going to say that the legalization of THC products several months ago by the legislature, I think might have taken some of the steam out of that. So I think it's important. Okay, any thoughts on Minnesota losing its status of the highest turnout in the country? Okay, we did come in 3rd. Any thoughts as why our midterm turnout dropped compared to 2018? We still need to think about that. And I think part of what we need to be thinking about here is many other states now are doing other experiments in voting. They are experimenting in terms of mail-in voting. They're doing a variety of other things. And I think that becomes important, and the fact that maybe that can explain something in terms of losing that status. So I think that's really critical to think about here. What is the judicial environment? Indictments that are on the state or federal level would eliminate Donald Trump as a potential candidate in 2024. There is all kinds of rumors that the Justice Department is close to potentially indicting Donald Trump. He might face an indictment in Georgia. There's still the ongoing litigation and possible additional indictments in New York. I think partly why Donald Trump was thinking of declaring his candidacy early is to try to foreclose this. Generally, the Justice Department has an informal policy that says it won't indict candidates running for office. So I think that's a possibility here. Also remember, let's say even if he were indicted, even if convicted, and even if went to jail, excuse me, I'm sorry, that does not foreclose him from running for president. Eugene V. Debs, back at 1912 election, was was in federal prison, ran as a third-party socialist candidate, and still got several million votes. So indictment and even conviction might damage him, but doesn't preclude him from running. You mentioned the state auditor's race. To what extent, if any, do you think the recent Feeding Our Future controversy played into how close the race was? I think it did. Although the state auditor has nothing to do, nothing to do with auditing the state. The state auditor audits local governments in Minnesota. But I think this was a case of where I credit the Republican candidate for creating a little bit of confusion, and the voters thought, well, where was the auditor on this issue? I also thought that the Feeding Our Future was going to be a bigger issue in terms of questions about competency, in terms of veracity, about the governor, and it didn't. You see ranked choice voting as a growing method of voting? Potentially, yes, but think about all the places that RCV has been adopted. They're all the liberal enclaves in the United States. Minneapolis, St. Paul, San Francisco, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Right now, it's viewed as a liberal tool. The Republicans are not embracing it. And so I think not yet at this point, because the Republicans, there is not bipartisan consensus to go with it. You'll get a few more liberal enclaves that will go with it. We'll see where it goes from there. I saw some early exit polls that Republicans did better than they have in the past with women and Latinos. Is this true? Any insights why? Yes, Republicans are doing a little bit better with Latinos, working class Latinos, and better with working class Blacks at this point. The Democrats are losing working class America. In Minnesota, think about the old name, Democratic Farmer and Labor. There are not many farmers who are part of the Democratic coalition, and they're losing labor. This is a major transformation. There's evidence the Democrats are still doing well with African Americans, still 90% plus, but they're down to around 70 or so percent Latinos. That's basically where George Bush was as president 20 years ago. I mean, in the 90s, I was teaching in Texas. At one point, George Bush was my governor, and George Bush was doing well with Latinos and understood the ability to understood or tried to reach out to Latinos. So in some sense, I think under Romney and under Trump, Democrats did exceedingly well. It may be going back to a norm that where we are right where we were before that. Okay, the two cannabis parties took a big bite out of Blaha's total. Possibly, yes, I haven't examined this. Other things that I haven't been able to examine in a lot of detail at this point too, is that someone told me this morning that in the state legislature in Minnesota, women are getting close to near parity in terms of gender parity, in terms of seats in the House and the Senate. I've not looked at that yet. If so, that's pretty significant in terms of a transformation that's occurred. Now, Molly's telling me there are two additional questions further up for you can grab. Okay, so I need to go back further and look at these. Okay, you mentioned the state auditor's race. To what extent do you think, okay, feeding our future, okay. Judicial environment, another poll, thoughts on Minnesota's litigant status. Okay. What is your recommendation to poll young voters if not accessible via traditional methods? Well, first off, I would start with texting them. I would try to text them as opposed to trying to call them on the phone. The second thing is I think we're asking the wrong questions about determining or ascertaining whether they're likely to vote. Asking them if they're interested, if they're likely to vote isn't going to work. Did they vote in the past isn't going to work. Asking them if they're following things on the social media is not going to work. I point out in the last few years, Bernie Sanders would get 25,000 people at a rally, 2,000 young people would vote. I think it's something more interesting. Hypothesis. If I want to find out if young people are voting, I want to ask them, are their friends voting? I want to tap into a peer pressure issue. If their friends are voting, if their friends are showing up, they are more likely that as younger people to vote. I would want to tap into that. And so that's where I'm starting to play with ideas. Again, this is sort of works in progress in terms of trying to think about things and how you get young people to show up and engage. I think you've got to be thinking about that issue, about using peer pressure. In past lectures, like you stated, there's one country in the Northeast United States where polling, there was predictive election outcomes. Can you say more about this? Yeah, generally, I still think this election is a pretty good one. Lackawanna County and Scranton, Pennsylvania are really good predictors. I was watching John King yesterday on CNN, and he pointed out again that Lackawanna County, where Scranton is, the Democrats did well there. Remember, Lackawanna County, Scranton is where Hillary Clinton's family was from, is where Joe Biden's was from. I will just mention that my mother's family was there. I spent a lot of time in Scranton growing up. I know Scranton exceedingly well. It's a pretty good bellwether at this point. In 2016, I said at one point, if Trump won Lackawanna County or got close, he would win Pennsylvania. If he won Pennsylvania, he would win the election. He got within 2 points of winning Lackawanna, won Pennsylvania, won the election. 2 years ago, Democrats, that is Joe Biden, took Lackawanna County, took Pennsylvania, then therefore won the election. And 2 days ago or 3 days ago, Democrats did well in Scranton, Lackawanna County, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say at this point, and my mother's family would be thrilled if I said it, as Scranton goes, so goes the nation. I think that's kind of cool in terms of thinking about it. And anybody who's wondering here, Scranton is nothing like on the television show The Office. I watched that show once, hated it myself, but I watched it because I wanted to see if it caught Scranton. Didn't catch it at all. Scranton used to be like the Iron Range in Minnesota. From Q&A, a scary prospect, but do you see any possibility of political violence following these midterm elections, particularly if the candidates do not concede or claim election fraud? I don't actually at this point. I really think for a couple of reasons. One, we're not going to see those widespread claims, even no matter even what happens in Georgia. I also think January 6th scared a lot of people, certainly not everybody. And I think there's a certain amount of, I don't know, exhaustion with the drama of American politics right now. Uh, how many of you have friends, and I have several of them who I love dearly, but they're high maintenance and they're drama prone. They're exhausting. I think there's a sense in which America got to a brink and pulled back. And it's like, I don't think we want to see this happen again. And so I want to be optimistic, as I said before, that one of the winners was American democracy. All right, so let's see. Molly, have I missed any questions? I'm looking to see here. I think I've gotten them all, but I'm just wondering if anybody else has any other questions too.
There's one at the very bottom there about the grassroots legalized cannabis party.
Lots of starters. Yeah, it did. I think pretty sure it did. Okay. Oh, the new book. Okay. So this is actually, so I sent you the link. The title is called Trumpism, American Politics in the Age of Polytainment. There's a great story to this book. About a quarter century ago, a student at Hamline and one of my graduate students, we coined a term called polytainment, about how American politics is the merger of politics and entertainment. And it's all about what that means. And I got interested about this concept of polytainment and what it means. I also got interested back in 2008 when the State Department sent me abroad to try to talk about American politics, to try to reduce American politics down to about 10 basic rules, to try to make American politics understandable to foreign audiences. And I do about 50 talks a year that I speak to non-academic audiences, and they want me to explain American politics. So in part, the book is a non-academic way of explaining what I call the rules of politics, the biorhythms of why candidates are successful, unsuccessful. Are there some basic rules that drive American politics? It's based upon good research, real political science, but it's in a non-academic form. Now, what also makes this book so fascinating, about a year and a half ago, I was doing a lecture to high school students at Hill Murray. And when I finished, I said, if any of you students want to contact me afterwards, please do so. And there was a woman, a junior at that time, her name was Avery Gaylor, contacted me and said, this is pretty cool. And she said, do you mind if I do some research with you? And I said, sure. And I told her about this book. And so this is a book that Avery and I put together. I needed pop cultural examples that would resonate with her generation. So the book is really what? The product of a baby boomer and of a Gen Z putting together examples, and it's written for a non-academic audience. She's now in college, but it's a cool concept now. It's out in Kindle right now. The book is only about 120 pages long. Again, it's very brief, very short. The paperback edition comes out in the next few days, and it's kind of a way of distilling a lot of really cool stuff about American politics that many of you would probably find enjoyable and find digestible. Okay, so please don't take a look at that if you wish. And then from Q&A is a Dominion lawsuit reining in misinformation. I think that scared the heck out of a lot of people. The fact that, and I'm also going to say that, what's his name now? The InfoWars guy, I forgot his name now. The people that were the Sandy Hook people who sued him. What's his name again? Jones? Is it Jones? You know what I'm referring to here. And what? He was awarded, Alex Jones, that's the name. I couldn't remember his first name. The Sandy Hook people were awarded what? $1.6 billion. I am kind of hoping at this point that we're starting to rein in lies in American politics. There's an article that's going to come out in New York Magazine in the next few days. I don't know when it is. A reporter interviewed me about a week ago, and I happen to be one of those, I don't know, crackpots who think that the First Amendment doesn't protect the right to lie. That it only should protect people who tell the truth at this point. And I'm sort of hoping that despite the Supreme Court not agreeing with me, maybe our culture is now saying, we've had enough with alternative facts. We've had enough with misinformation. The title of the book, Trumpism, American Politics in the Age of Polytainment. If you click on the link, and if you go to back, I think it's the very first it should be what, just about at 11:32, if you go back up in the chats, there should be from me to everybody the link to it. So you should be able to, okay, and Molly reposted it. That's good. All right, so we got about 1 minute to go. I think Molly needs to do some sort of wrap up here. I hope you found the talk enjoyable today. And again, if I can just throw one thing in here. Let's see, can I do this to everybody here? Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna put in, hope I typed it right. Yep, there's my email. So if anybody wants to, actually, I think I only sent it to Molly. So if Molly wants to repost it to everybody, go ahead. Cool. But anyhow, Molly, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, David. I'm just gonna put that right into the chat. There we go. And one other thing for folks to know, we've recorded the session. We'll put it up on our website. It takes us a little while to get it up there, but you can find it there again as well if you want to go back. And thank you, David, also for offering to field additional questions. I don't think we got to all of them, and I don't think either of us thought we would. So thanks for offering to field a few after this. So thank you. Thanks, Professor Schultz. Thanks everybody for joining us. It's just a pleasure. We will have more Leo lectures in calendar year 2023. And as always, if you have ideas of either speakers or topics or anything that catches your fancy that you want us to see if we can go track something down, please let me know. I'm always looking for great ideas. And it is one of the most fun parts of our job here to put together lectures and bring people together on Zoom. So thank you again. Everybody have a great weekend, and I really appreciate it. Bye now.
Bye, Al.